Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Acts. And today we are going to read chapters 23 and 24. So we got a couple more weeks of reading through the Book of Acts, and then we will move on to the Book of Romans, which I will do in a very different way because, of course, for the entirety of the last year and a half since I've been doing this, I've done mostly Bible books that were a lot more narrative in format. So an easy way of seeing this was how I read the book of Exodus and then skipped Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy because, especially more so with Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're not really narrative formatted. And the way I did most of the other, not most of, pretty much all the other Bible studies was a lot more of studying the narrative and the story aspect of the Bible and the Bible stories we were reading. But the book of Romans will be very, very different. And so it'll be a weird mix of like how I used to do the podcast when I was doing them for a while. I kind of ran out of good topics to do. But being a lot more philosophical and reading the book of Romans that way, I think is a good mental exercise for us to do. And so that's going to be how the book of Romans will be very different. And so it's going to be quite different when we transition out of the book of Acts. Since, as I mentioned previously, the book of Acts is, in fact, if you really think about it, is the last narrative in the Bible. Revelation serves like it's not more so much as a story in the way of like how you interpret any traditional narrative. Revelation doesn't really work like that. And so I wouldn't count the book of Revelation as like a biblical narrative. It's a very different type of literature, if you will. But anyway, that's besides the point. The point is that we are going to end the book of Acts, and then when we start the book of Romans, which will be sometime in August, I'll take like a short break after reading Acts, get some build-up traction with the Xenoblade Chronicles Let's Play, which what I'm hoping with Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it will lend itself a lot to a lot more theological discussions because, I mean, that's one of the amazing Xenoblade games, kind of good. Especially the first one. The second one was very different from the first one. And then, of course, unfortunately, and then one day I'll do like a throwback Thursday with Xenoblade, Xenosaga, which is one of my favorite games. And then that game like has a lot more philosophical and theological kind of discussion in those games, and one reason why I love them so much. But let's not get crazy, but just some thoughts for down the road. But as we move into the book of Romans, it's just going to be very different from how we do the Bible studies right now. But anyway, we're looking at like another month away still, so let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Today we are reading Acts chapters 23 and 24, which is pretty close to the end because the book of Acts ends at chapter 28. So, a couple more weeks of the book of Acts. So I hope you guys are learning something and enjoying reading through the story with me. But anyway, today, Acts 23-24, that's the plan. I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV, with some Michael Ewan abridged. Or I guess I should call it the Streaming Parson abridged. I should stop throwing my real name around like that. Not like you guys don't already know that. I make it no secret. But Streaming Parson abridged of the NIV. But anyway, before we start, I'll give you a moment to, flip to it, whether you have a physical copy or use the Bible app or something. Bible Online. They're free. No reason not to use them. I'll begin us off with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I pray that as we read your word today, that you would continue to inspire and bless us as we desire to be closer to you and to know you more. I pray you would reveal yourself to us. I pray this in the name of your Son. Amen. Okay, so just a quick kind of recap of the last, well, really last week, and then like a little bit from the week before, is basically we've moved into the last kind of story arc of the Book of Acts, where it's basically Paul in Jerusalem and the end of the missionary journey. And the larger overarching theme in the Book of Acts is how the Spirit of God has really has really made a, no, that's not the best word for it, has really made a culture shock, if you will, with this new kind of cultural phenomenon or movement, a social movement or whatever you want to call it, which we know as Christianity. And so now we, as we get into this last story arc of Paul in Jerusalem, we kind of really see how much Christianity has changed a fair amount of how the Jewish people especially operated, and of course the expansion of that as Christianity has obvious influence among like other nations, I guess you could say. And so, for instance, in the last chapter, I think it was chapter 22, or was it chapter 21 when they were accusing Paul of stuff? But anyway, you have like Greeks just walking around in Jerusalem. Now, of course, by the first century, I mean, people could go all over, and so it's not on, like, let me put it this way. There's nothing to stop a non-Jewish person from going to Jerusalem. But at the same time, one of those things that, like, many people tend to forget, or is kind of forgotten about, because if you read the Bible narrative, and this is where some people say, well, the Bible narrative can be a little bit unreliable at times, is that contrary to popular belief, if you really think about it, the land of Israel was more like a backwater place. And the only reason why anyone would go there was because it just so happened to be in a really nice location that a bunch of other nations would cross through. But in the grand scheme of things, nobody would actually want to be there. It's kind of like the hellhole you have to pass through. I know it sounds terrible to describe Jerusalem that way, but that was kind of how people treated Jerusalem in the first century. Of course, Israel being right in between Egypt, Iraq, well, what is now Iraq, basically, and moving into Europe with Greece, and then, of course, Italy over the Mediterranean and whatnot. Israel was in what they call the Fertile Crescent. That's what we call it now, anyway. The Fertile Crescent is a very nice location that all these other nations would have to pass through. But at the same time, those other nations that would frequently pass through Israel and Jerusalem, by extension, they would consider the place pretty backwater, so you wouldn't see like a lot of Gentiles hanging around there. But the fact that from this place, this backwater place, this cultural phenomenon has occurred that has affected all these places. And so now we see how Jerusalem's they're not sure what to do, because this crazy movement that they thought was just some kind of cult that originated in their own city, it's gained a lot of influence. And so that's kind of the mindset you have to see as we read through Paul's little adventure in Jerusalem, if you will, and how much ire, if you will, is pushed against the Christians from the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are thinking like, wow, the world used to think we were backwater before, and now you give them more reason to think we're even, more brain dead. And so, I hate to say this, and it sounds terrible, and if I get deleted off YouTube, so be it. But like, it's that whole like justifying anti-Semitism. It sounds so terrible to say it that way, but that was kind of what was happening, and that was kind of the attitude that the Jews had toward Christianity. And it's one of those things, and it's unfortunately the way it is in the world today, where yes, there has been some rough parts of Christian history, and then that has led to a modern sweep and a massive growth of anti-Semitism. I mean, Adolf Hitler was one of those like prime points of that, because of how the world at that time was kind of moving away, was becoming antagonistic to Christianity. It is not irrelevant. Contrary to popular belief, it is not a new phenomenon of this massive anti-Christian movement. But with people like Adolf Hitler and the unfortunately spotted history of Christianity, had created this much larger form of anti-Semitism that really hit an apex with the Nazis, and then still exists today, quite strong, contrary to popular belief. Unfortunately, of course, my response to that would be, well, that's all the more reason that Christians, read your Bibles, understand God's promises to Israel, and support your Jewish brothers and sisters. Okay, they need us now more than ever, despite the fact we are also part of why they go through so much anti-Semitism. Okay, but in all seriousness, I mean, not that the other statement wasn't serious, but as we read through the book of Acts, what I'm trying to get at here is this idea of, because of the growth of Christianity and other people who were kind of hostile to Jews are now even more so. And what I want Christians to understand is that this is kind of the legacy we have to deal with, but that doesn't change the fact that Jesus has called us to love our enemies. All the more reason that we need the power of Christ to empower us to love our enemies, because that's how the Jews definitely see us. And you read in something like here in the book of Acts, in this last story arc that we're reading, the Jews feel like, man, this cult, Christianity, has created more reasons for people to hate us. And so, of course, the comfort is that Jesus would remind his followers that it's not us that they hate, it is Christ that they have rejected. But at the same time, there's this kind of a weird way of wording it, is that there's this legitimacy to this complaint that the Jewish people have. That, oh great, look at, people already thought we were backwater, and now this cult has grown out of control, and it has given people more reason to hate us. And so it is just, I bring up this very serious matter very early in the video, because I really want, more importantly, to keep this on the, okay, so the first thing you want to keep in mind is that from the story's context, there needs, you kind of need, I kind of wanted to use to bring some modern illustration backwards, and to apply it to the text, because in a way that it's kind of one of those, like, it's a human problem, and all the more reason we need Jesus. That there's been this anti-Semitism. It's not a new phenomenon. It has always existed. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, Christianity has ties to that. And it is our responsibility to help combat it. Because, hey, Christ has called us to love one another. And so we are to help our Jewish brothers and sisters as they have to combat this problem that they may our Jewish friends may believe that we have brought upon them. And on the one hand, I'm not trying to say that, like, oh, it's not our fault. I mean, clearly, yes, our existence is a problem. You just got to deal with it. But at the same time, of course, I mean, you could, I'm not going to play the lame card and say, like, well, maybe other people should just learn not to be hateful and not to be racist. You can't, okay? Despite all the feminist ramblings. You can't make people unlearn things like hate, like anti-Semitism. It doesn't just happen like that, okay? Only the power of Christ can truly change people. And even then, there's some shifty parts in that. So I mean, it's one of those things that you can't just make people unlearn stuff, okay? It's not like that. But in the story's context, as we read the high antagonism toward Christians from Jews, it what I, the point the one of the points I want to make is that it's not an unwarranted thing, because we see this to the modern day, which is how I should have opened up this statement. It's something that has kept on even back in the first century with the early church. This has always been a problem, and it leads us all the more reason that we must, be faithful to Christ and be hopeful in Jesus redeeming us in the second coming and all that. Because this animosity doesn't just, go away. And in a way, the growth of Christianity has added on to this problem that the Jewish people face. And this is the real reason, as we read through the book of Acts, why the Jewish people were so hostile toward Christians. It wasn't just a theological difference of saying like, okay, you want to believe that the resurrection already happened with this Jesus guy, and we're not going to accept that. It's more than just a theological thing. But of course, it was a very political thing in the first century. We know this to be the case because, we read in later history, not long later anyway, 70 AD, few more Jewish revolts, and the Romans were like, all right, we're tired of you. Burn Jerusalem down. And that's basically what happened. This is the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. And so we read here in Acts that kind of build up to that time. Now, the weird thing that we have to kind of question as we read through the book of Acts, and whether the book of Luke doesn't retroactively write this kind of thing down. And this is where you get into some weird, like, I'm not sure territory of, once again, whether the book of Luke was written before the destruction of the temple. And if that was the case, then, it's a lot more prophetic. Luke can see the future kind of thing. Or if the book of Acts, as we have it, was written after 70 AD, which is more likely the case. And these kind of underlying tones of like, yeah, the temple's destruction and all that. But of course, the Christian perspective is also thrown in here, and that's why you got to read the book of Luke, which I do have a playlist on. But basically, the idea that you don't have to be so stuck in the physical, and Christianity being a movement, one of the major radical ideas of Christianity was that the religious experience was not centralized around like a physical apex. So this is where some people would refer to like Judaism as like having a temple cult. And they're not the only ones to do this. The temple cult idea is that you have a centralized place of worship. And in Judaism, that would be the temple in Jerusalem. Islam has the what is the mosque's actual name in Mecca? I don't want to just call it the Great Mosque of Mecca. It has an actual name. If someone knows what it is, please inform me properly. I mean, I could just look it up. But if you know what it is, leave it in the comments. There's the main mosque in Mecca is a modern example. It's still there. It's a highly revered place, and it's an apex of Islamic worship. And then, of course, you read in like older documents how what is that tower in Japan called? There's that tower, and it's supposed to be like the main place of worship as you face the sun, and that's why Japan is called the land of the rising sun and all that stuff. And so as the sun, and then this tower kind of stands at this point as like the first contact, if you will, of the sun Of course, we know that's not how the world really is, but remember, this is ancient people doing this, and the way they, we still use that language today of like the sun rising, even though we know the Earth just spins. But that's besides the point. What the point I am getting at is, it's not an old idea of like, or let me put it this way: the older idea is having a primary like place of worship, but Christianity kind of turned that on its head and said, no, it is only in the person of Jesus, and no matter who we are and where we go, when we pray to Jesus, that's where we have the church collective. That's a much more modern idea. That's kind of one of the funny things, and make a reference of this in the Thor Ragnarok. Kind of has this reference where like Odin tells Thor, Asgard is not a place, Asgard is the people. That's a very modernized idea. Traditional Odin would never have thought this, because obviously they would have been very centralized. And you think of like using mythology as our reference. A good example is how the Greek gods have Mount Olympus as like the centerpiece of where the gods live, even though all the gods have their own places. Poseidon has his undersea throne, which is later interpreted to be Atlantis, and then Apollo has his throne, which is basically like this place near the sun or whatever. He lives like around the sun, kind of thing, and his chariot goes around it. He has a primary chair that sits above it. That's kind of his resting place, and places like that. But of course, all the gods come and convene on Mount Olympus. It's like a centerpiece, and so there's this idea in the ancient world about how worship is meant to be like centralized, but Christianity had kind of wildly drastically changed this, because Christians be like that, and they didn't make it so much about a place. But with all these crazy ideas running around, and this is one of those things that, like, once again, we are looking backward, so it's kind of harder to say like whether the Christians already knew this, or it's just a natural consequence of how history plays out. There's no real way of knowing. But basically, a big part of this radicalization of Christian thinking of, worship isn't about like where you worship, but just the focus on Jesus Christ fundamentally. Then when Jerusalem gets destroyed, which is something that the Bible never really, at least not here, not in the book of Acts. There are some parts in the gospel where Jesus does mention, and we read this in like the book of Luke a little bit, where Jesus talks about how like no stone will still be standing on top of each other here in Jerusalem, and people would talk about how that Jesus was prophesying about the destruction in 70 AD. But when we're in the book of Acts, the Christians didn't think too much about this. They weren't too worried. Well, because they weren't too worried about it. I guess they have that whole like, well, Jesus is gonna take care of it, so we kind of like don't think about it as much. Which, on a side note, and I know this sounds like me being mega cynical and critical of other Christians, but we should take a page from these guys here in the book of Acts and not worry too much about like when some people think, oh, the end is coming soon. Jesus' second coming could, I mean, it could happen any time. That's true. But some people are saying like, oh, it's this generation. It's gonna happen. In the next 5 years. It's like, look, man, like, you guys gotta chill, because there's a chance he might not come. And then what's gonna happen when your predictions are wrong? But the attitude Christians should have is like, well, we already have our assurance in Christ. So why do you need to worry so much? And I think that's something that a Christian could take some lessons from. Like, that was the way that these guys were thinking in the book of Acts. The Christians weren't overly too worried about it, because they knew that, like, okay, we know there's some political turmoil, and so things are going to get rough. But we also know that, like, our citizenship isn't on earth, and Paul goes further into this. You read a lot more of this in, like, think. See, I always get Ephesians and Philippians mixed, but one of them he definitely talks about it. Book of Romans he kind of talks about a little bit, not very much though. But basically, since our citizenship is in heaven, we don't need to worry too much about, like, as crazy as the political turmoil happens. Which is an interest, which I don't know why I'm, you're probably wondering why I'm going on this long rambling, but basically, I should probably bring it back to what we're reading now. As we read through chapters 23 and 24, what's interesting is that some people may get the idea that, like, oh, but the Bible does make things political as we read through here. But I think you have to remember that we're not really reading it so much from the Christian perspective anymore. Because we're reading about one Christian guy, Paul, and this little adventure he's going on. And the perspective of the story is more about the Jewish perspective and their concerns that come about because of the Christian movement. And so, we've been reading through the book of Acts, and it's all about, like, oh, here's Christianity being awesome over here, and Christianity expanding over there, and all this stuff that, is happening, and hence the, the explosion of Christianity and its expansion. But now we're reading, in these last few chapters of Acts, we kind of read the results of this expansion from the Jewish perspective. I know there's so much more I could say about that, but I've already been talking for like 30 minutes and haven't actually started reading the Bible yet. So let's actually start reading now. And then we'll come back to, the other stuff I was just talking about. Alright, so I'm going to start a couple verses before chapter 23 actually starts. So this is like chapter 22, verse 30 is where we're going to start. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Now Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." And at this, the high priest Ananias, another Ananias. Too many of these guys are the same name. Anyways, high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Oh, brothers, I didn't realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'You do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and other Pharisees, he called out to them in the Sanhedrin, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When Paul said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Because, as established before, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all these things. Now there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if an angel or spirit had spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. So he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul. "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink anything until they had killed Paul. It's kind of extreme, but okay. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. So they went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case, and we are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister, so his nephew, heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called for one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So the soldier took the boy to the commander. And the centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you." The commander took the boy by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it that you want to tell me?" The boy said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone what you have reported to me." So then the commander called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen." Kind of overkill for guys there. And send to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. The commander wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know more on why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found out the accusation has something to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. The cavalry arrived in Caesarea, and they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from, learning that he was from Caesarea. Felix said, "I will hear of your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Alright, so chapter 23. So basically, just Paul causing trouble. Basically, by proclaiming Jesus. What else is new? So I gotta love this little bit here when Paul actually appears before the Sanhedrin. And there's this, okay, so first of all, the first elephant in the room is like, come on, do we really have to have another guy named Ananias? Because we're gonna read about the other Ananias later in chapter 24. It's like, man, like, come on. All these guys are the same names though. It's one of those things that, like, it's annoying to read at times, and it's like, oh, keeping track of who's who. But I mean, I guess it can't be helped. It's just, you know, it's kind of Luke reported. I guess you could make the case that Luke is reporting accurately because people actually have the same name. It's not like in fiction where people actually everybody has different names somehow because that's how it is in fiction because you know the writer can do that. Whereas assuming Luke is reporting things quite accurately, then it just so happens that all these guys have the same name. You just kind of have to deal with it. Even though I must admit it is annoying as a reader to deal with of reading like wait is it another Ananias? Is it the same? Wait, who is this guy? Is he the same guy as the first guy? But I thought that guy died. But anyway, we have another Ananias. But this Ananias ain't an ordinary Ananias. He's apparently the current high priest. But this begs a question though, because there's this part here where Paul like talks some mad shit to this guy. And it's one of those things that like you read it here as text, and it's like, okay, in 2022 we have come up with way more colorful words to insult people. Let's just say that. But for Paul to say it, you know, for Paul to call this guy a whitewashed wall would have been extremely insulting. Now, if you can recall, Jesus actually refers to the religious leaders of his time as whitewashed tombs. And so, I'm pretty sure I explained this pretty well then, but I'll explain it again. That basically when the expression calling someone whitewashed wall or a whitewashed tomb, the idea is basically you're spineless. You're completely spineless is what is the accusation being made because basically think of it like when you bleach something, it loses all color, it uses all, and by losing all color, it kind of loses like what makes it what it is. If that makes sense, like you take a shirt and then you bleach it and it turns to a completely white shirt. You lose any indication of what it used to be, whether the shirt had a color, whether the shirt had designs on it or something like that. If you bleach through clothing like that, the clothing loses all its character, I guess you could say. And so in a similar fashion, that's how people would, you know, when you completely clean a wall off and you make it a whitewash wall, the idea is you're devoid of character. But of course, you know, not just like when I say you're devoid of character, I don't mean like just like personality wise, which is also true. But if you're devoid of character, a way you could interpret that is, you know, there is nothing to you that's of substance, and thus you're basically worthless. You're trash. And then of course there's the hypocrisy thing too. So calling people a flat out hypocrite is also extremely insulting, which is one of those funny things. Like we can come up with all these like fancy colored like insults to people, but I kid you not, if you just called out someone on like some bullshit coming out of their mouth and you call them a hypocrite, you don't need colorful language. The word hypocrite enough and calling someone else and calling someone that would be more than enough of an insult. I mean, unless you're like, you know, your true crazy tankies would probably wear that with pride because they're, well, neurotic sociopaths. But minus those people, any rational average person would be extremely insulted. You called them a hypocrite because, of course, you're calling them out on you know, you're essentially calling them out on their bullshit. And so, by Paul calling the high priest a whitewashed wall, he's kind of implying that you're just, you know, you have no spine, you're spineless, you have no character, no integrity. You know, you're nothing. But, you know, instead of using that many words, you just call them a whitewashed wall. And that was kind of what Paul was getting at, which once again would have been extremely insulting to, if you called someone, Mr. Shit person. Well, if you someone with a shit person, I would still have some definition to them. But like, it's so bad that you're so bland and worthless. And that was kind of the idea when you call someone whitewash, which yes would have been extremely insulting to call someone that. Like you go call someone, you know, bland and no personality, and see how far that gets you. You'll probably get your ass kicked. But I also prefer. I also recommend you don't do that because you're for your own safety. But the point I'm getting at is, for Paul to, which is funny because Paul does it in the Sanhedrin, so he's in front of a bunch of like religious leaders, and he just straight up uses this kind of like colorful language. Ironically, he uses this colorful language at them, and so, like, of course, the high priest is gonna be like, "Who the hell does this guy think he is? Punch him in the face! Who's this? Punish him for his insubordination." And then, of course, like, after one of the like temple guards tells Paul, "This is the high priest you're talking to. You don't talk like that." And I love how Paul's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. The the Torah and the reference I think is Exodus 23 or something like that. Exodus 22, 23. One of the many laws that God starts giving Moses in the end of Exodus. That Paul refers to when he says, the law tells us not to insult our leaders. And so Paul kind of like, on the one hand, it looks like he's backpedaling, like, oh, I'm so, like retracting the stuff I just said to you. But then at the same time, it's kind of coy for Paul to like use scripture as his like, oh, I should be nicer to you. But it's kind of like this ironic moment because like, the Sanhedrin is kind of bullying Paul. And then Paul's like, well, the scripture says, not to be a bully. So it's kind of like ironic. And, like Paul's being pretty cheeky. And I think that's kind of what makes the story kind of entertaining. That Paul can be cheeky in the face of like all these religious leaders just cracking down on him and ready to lay down the hammer. I always found that kind of funny. And then, of course, after Paul kind of like does his little backpedaling thing, he goes on the offensive again. And I love how the Bible describes it like Paul looks in the room. And it's one of those things that, like, once again, like, when the Sanhedrin is set up this way, it's like, how does anything ever get done? And how are these people not always at each other's throats? Because the Bible points out to us that, yes, the Sanhedrin is composed of both Pharisees and Sadducees. Probably, for equality purposes. You must have both philosophical schools of thought present. But the funny thing is the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as I've talked many times before, go watch my book of Luke read, where I go in more detail about the differences between Sadducees and Pharisees. TLDR, the Bible already tells us, Sadducees they didn't believe in like supernatural forces. And so like stuff like the resurrection, they didn't believe in stuff like that. Whereas the Pharisees do believe in supernatural forces. And so Paul immediately goes like, well, I'm here on trial because of my Pharisee beliefs and my belief in the resurrection. And the funny thing is, he doesn't actually go in detail about this. He doesn't talk about like, well, I believe Jesus is risen from the dead and stuff like that. He doesn't actually need, because of course Paul doesn't need to do that. All he has to do is just poke at the Sadducees enough to piss them off. And then, of course, if the Sadducees react, which they do, then the Pharisees would be, whoa, 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 are you insulting our beliefs? And so, yeah. It's one of those things that, like, it kind of makes Paul look kind of like he's a little mischievous, because, like, he does this knowing this is what's going to happen. And at the same time, you wonder, like, what does Paul get out of causing this much trouble between, like, the factions within the Sanhedrin, because it can't go well. And so, but I mean, what we read is that that's what Paul does, and he kind of causes this riot within the Sanhedrin. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is it also shows the fundamental breakdown of, you know, the Jewish religious order, if you will. Because despite this whole, like, oh, you know, they're trying to be organized, the fact that they're under Roman rule, like, they can get told what to do by a Roman commander, as we read at the end of chapter 22. These guys don't possess the power they think they do. And the writer is letting us know, like, how much of an illusion, if you will, that the religious leaders are trying to put up. But clearly it's breaking apart pretty quickly. And Paul sees right through this and just decides to just break the glass. You know, he's that kid in that Ming China store. And he just knocks one thing over, and a domino effect of everything breaking in the store. Yeah, that's what Paul's doing with these guys. To the point that what's going on? A riot inside the Sanhedrin. And it shows that, like, wherever Christianity goes, I mean, it's, you know, I guess is one of a running joke that there's just riots every time. No matter where Christianity goes, there's riots. But of course, you know, some people may say, well, see, Christianity is so mean. They cause people to fight. But the fact of the matter is, all that it's really doing is just exposing how fragile the world really is. Of course, from a theological perspective, it's one of those all the more reason that we cannot put our trust in this world. And, you know, as you read through Acts 23 is a good example of that. You cannot put your trust in this world, because even the religious orders and the religious elites, they don't got it together. It's very fragile and easily broken, which Paul clearly he clearly takes advantage of that and screws around with the Pharisees and Sadducees there, which once again is kind of entertaining, but at the same time it's just a good reminder of us knowing how fragile this world is. You know, no matter where you go. But it's all the more reason that you know, as we have our faith in Christ, we recognize that we are citizens of God's kingdom and not of this world, because and the security we have in that, because we know that this world is fleeting. We know this world is just hanging on threads, and is just ready to come crashing down. And reading chapter 23 proves that. You know, this religious elite that's supposed to act as like a professional courtroom. But I mean, if you watch any kind of court drama, you know that courtrooms are, you know, there isn't real order. And the judge may call to order at times, but there will always be outbreaks in court, kind of thing. Well, at least that's in a courtroom drama. That's not how courtrooms always are. But you get the idea that in the grand scheme of things, there isn't really order in the world, and that what we pertain as order is just an illusion. But rather, you know, the real order is in the one who speaks order, and that is, you know, Jesus Christ himself. Continuing on, I'm going to skip that little bit about the whole, like, because we talked about this a little bit already. But there's a part where Jesus once again visits Paul, and he talks to him about, you will go to Rome. You will testify about me in Rome, so and so on. Which, you know, we'll talk more about that when you get to the book of Romans anyway, so no need to talk about it here. Then we get to the second part of chapter 23, and it begins with these, like, I don't know what to call these guys. They're like Jewish zealots, I guess. They're zealots of some kind. And they come up with this, like, oath, which if you read through the Bible, making rash oaths is never a good idea. But I mean, it's also a human nature thing that we just like to make rash oaths because people are impulsive like that. And so these guys on their impulses are like, we're not gonna eat or drink until we kill Paul. Well, good luck with that. And they even like try to come up with a plan to like have Paul like lured out for them, and they want to ambush him so they can do an Ides of March with him. And I think it's kind of funny that there's a kind of like an Ides of March kind of thing here where they're like, yo, let's have him like come out and appear before the Sanhedrin, similar to Julius Caesar was going to the Senate one day, and then he gets stabbed. He gets stabbed to death. If you know the Ides of March story of Julius Caesar, there's that kind of little funny. I mean, at least I see it. There's a little bit of that parallel where these guys are like, "Oh, we're gonna draw him out, and then when the time is right, we're just gonna like ambush him and kill this guy." Because of course they can't charge the barracks. That wouldn't work. And the barracks is teeming with armed Roman soldiers. So, and 40 guys is not a big enough raid. Despite what World of Warcraft has taught you, 40 guys is not enough to go raiding. Especially a Roman barracks. Never a good idea. So they plan to lure Paul out. And then this like this most random ass thing. Where like we have this kid who so happens to be Paul's nephew. Which I guess would explain why he'd be quick to warn Paul. Because, they're family and all that. I mean, that doesn't make it automatic. Because he could just be a shitty nephew. But and, in our modern day and age, we like to claim that we would be nice for strangers, but let's be real, that's a lie. So, I guess the fact that this kid is Paul's relative is relevant. Because the assumption is that family is more likely to protect each other. I mean, it's all about family. But we have this kid who, it's like... the perfect coincidence that like it's Paul's nephew that overhears these guys with this conspiracy to ambush Paul. Of all people to hear this plot, I mean, I guess these guys weren't very good at their secret meeting because some rando hears it. So that's a fail on these guys' part. Not much else to really say here in this part of the story. It's just like, oh yeah, this happened and that happened. The nephew goes to the barracks to warn Paul, and then, of course, he is later told to give the warning to the commander himself. And then I love how the commander reacts, though. The commander's like... Oh, we're gonna send, like... How many guys is it? Like, 70 cavaliers, like, 200 foot soldiers? It's something ridiculous. Okay, let me read where it was again. It's like 70 horsemen, 200 soldiers, and 200 spearmen. So, I mean, I guess soldiers and spearmen are two different things. But, assuming that they are two different things, that's like almost 500 guys to protect one guy from 40 guys. Kind of overkill. But, of course, the letter that the commander writes to the governor reminds us that Paul is a Roman citizen. So there's the whole like whether it's in the Roman commander's interest or not. In a way, he's actually protecting the Jewish people by this overkill protection detachment. Because once again, if a bunch of Jews attack a Roman citizen, that can get really, really bad. Heck, you could have Roman commanders issue like large, sweeping, military occupation and killing a whole bunch of people. Let's just go with that. Over the death of a Roman citizen, especially by non-Romans like these Jewish guys. And so, on the one hand, we want to laugh about how the commander goes overkill on like 470 guys to protect one guy. But at the same time, it is actually better for the Jewish people that they don't succeed in killing Paul. Because that would have huge, like, how do I put it? Huge, not just legal ramifications, but like challenging the Roman authority. And then that would just bring up the Romans' ire, and that is not a good place to be. And so it's I don't know, I just find it interesting that, like, I know many people critique the story by saying, like, well, the commander is overreacting. I mean, he might be a contender for one of the top overreactions in the Bible. It's a good contender. So 470 guys to protect one guy from 40 guys. On the list. Then we get to this last part of the chapter, and it's basically when Paul is transferred. He's no longer a prisoner in Jerusalem, or rather, put in asylum, I guess you could say, in Jerusalem. And he's sent to a prison in Caesarea under the, I guess, the governor of that region. Because it's funny, because, like, technically they would have a governor in Jerusalem as well. But I guess they didn't want to leave him there, so they sent him away. So that's kind of how chapter 23 ends. It's just Paul is sent to Caesarea. He makes it. I mean, to be fair, with a large military expedition behind your back, I mean, you would hope so. Okay, so chapter 24. Just gonna take a little coffee break here. Do you have any questions about the Book of Acts so far? Go ahead, shoot. Just need to stretch a little bit here in my chair. Oh, well, I'm getting a little bit of a sleep spell, but I'll make it to the end of the stream. I'm not gonna, like, pass out like I did at one time. But at the same time, it's, in all seriousness, the real reason why I'm, like, pretty tired at like 4 in the afternoon is honestly because, like, now I know someone might say, like, oh, but you live in Canada, it's not that hot. But at the same time, it is. I don't know what it is. It can't just be the heat alone. But I do find it a little bit tougher to, like, sleep longer in the summer. I don't know what it is. It's been like that every year for me. I get a little bit less sleep every summer than I would normally. And so it's just a good reminder that, like, sleep is that important, because you lose a little bit of sleep and it makes a big difference. And you're seeing that difference now with me and becoming a little bit drowsy at 4 in the afternoon. So just how it be sometimes. And if you're wondering, there's just some homemade iced coffee that I have here. Because, you got to get your iced coffee fix. Anyway, here we go. Chapter 24. So 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly made my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges that they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect, a cute word for cult. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law, and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive away to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin? Unless it was this one thing, I shouted as I stood in their presence, it is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Then Felix, who was acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias, the commander, comes... I gotta do Felix's voice. When Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. So Felix ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Alright, so the TLDR of chapter 24 is basically Paul dealing with this current governor, a dude named Felix. And so there's not really a lot here to talk about other than like Paul just making Paul retelling basically the earlier chapters about how, but what I'm doing isn't out of the ordinary. What I'm doing is, just part of Jewish faith and just part of our Jewish culture. I'm not doing any like criminal activity or anything like that. Nothing out of the ordinary per se. Until he admits that, like, well, I am technically part of this, what you call a Jewish sect, which, once again, cute way of saying you're a cult member. But Paul's like, yeah, other than a little difference in our beliefs, I I'm not accused of any real crime. The only reason why I'm here is because I have a slightly different belief. And the funny thing is that, like, and here's the other thing too, that many people tend to forget about, like, the similarities between Judaism and Christianity is that, like, actually they believe mostly the same things. But the only real difference is, of course, that Christians do believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and that Jesus was who he said he was. Whereas Jews tend to deny most of that because they don't want to say that, like, well, the Messiah did in fact come, because that would change their entire worldview, which is what Christians adopted. So how about that? But I love how Paul just basically just tells it like it is. He's just like, the only reason why I'm here is because I have a slightly different belief. And you're treating me like a criminal. And it's one of those things that, like, the Bible plays it as a joke. That, like, this is meant to kind of sound really silly. But unfortunately, and now by saying it like this, I'm kind of stepping on eggshells now. But unfortunately, we've kind of run into this problem in the world today. And I think what's interesting about reading this little story about Paul and his little misadventures in Jerusalem and now in Caesarea, I think it's something that especially us Christians today need to really brace ourselves for. Because, some people say, man, I wish I was like Paul. Yeah. In the world today, it doesn't take a lot of steps to get there. Let's just say that. And, with the political climate, the religious climate we live in today, you can actually find yourself pretty easily in trouble for what you believe and the little differences you do believe in. And, it's not to be taken lightly, even though the Bible here kind of treats it like it's a joke. And yeah, I know that's a bit of a bold claim, but the Bible does treat it like a bit of a joke. That, like, oh, Paul. Well, at least Paul. Let me rephrase that. Paul treats it like it's a bit of a joke, not the Bible itself, but the Bible does portray accurately that Paul treats this like a joke. And I guess it's one of those funny things too. And I mentioned this with the martyrdom of Stephen, which I think there's a huge irony behind this. That the very same guy that Paul approved the killing of, Paul takes a similar attitude in the way that he faces authority. He's like, well, kind of already screwed, so you might as well have a good time with it. And I know that sounds like kind of morbid too, but at the same time, it's like, well, that's the reality. And I think Paul being brave here, and his bravery is shown by him kind of treating it like a joke. Even though, like, in the world today, I think many a Christian, they can allow themselves to be stuck by fear, and not be bold in what they believe in. And I think reading this story in Acts 24 is a reminder that, like, nah, you can be bold, but there's nothing wrong with having, if you need to turn things into a joke to be bold and to put on a brave face, there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, you should be encouraged, because that's kind of what Bible people did when they had to face these kind of hardships. If the opportunity gives for it, turn it into a joke and learn to have a laugh along the way. And so, yeah, I kind of like how Paul just treats it like a joke. He's just like, it's not a big deal that, like, I'm here for a stupid reason. So, I mean, you can let me go and just let me do my own thing. That would be the easy way of doing things, right? And then, of course, it just shows how, once again, how weak the world really is, despite the brave face it puts on. Because Felix could be like, well, I guess it's just one of your little Jewish differences. So go along your little Jewish ways and leave me alone. Which is kind of one of those funny things that, like, it. This is underlying tone that the Bible lays down, and I never really talked about this in great detail. But I guess I have extra time right now, so I can. Because I'm basically done the bulk of reading. Chapter 25, 20, 23, and 24 are pretty short chapters, so I'm basically done already. And so we could kind of talk about this little underlying theme that the book of Luke, well, the New Testament narratives, I should say, so the Gospels and the book of Acts, all kind of they played this a little bit. But of course, we look back from the we're looking back from the 21st century and be like, oh yeah, duh. But at the time, the Romans did not think this. They did not think that their society was on the brink of collapse, because they were, they were kind of arrogant on how good things were. But the Christians knew. They knew that, this isn't gonna hold. This Pax Romana isn't gonna hold. And so, in order to assure people, well, that was one of the main goals of the gospel, is to bring comfort and assurance to people, despite the crumbling. Wow, Asian Tourette's right there. The crumbling, social structure that we have. There is something we can put our hope in. There is something we can put our trust in, and ultimately that's in Jesus Christ. But one of the major functions of the gospel was to remind people that there is a hope, and that there is a way to know real peace, and not this fleeting peace that Rome was offering. Now I bring this up because we had several times in these New Testament narratives, primarily with the death of Jesus, and now we see it here, where despite Rome being in charge, you can clearly see that they don't have a lot of backbone. They're just told what to do by the backwater people, kind of thing. And I made that joke earlier about how the rest of the world would have seen the Jewish people as kind of backwater, primitive and not as intellectual. They weren't as developed as the rest of us. And this in the same way that your northern United States citizen might view the South. That was kind of how the rest of the world kind of viewed the Jews. And so, but at the same time, it is these same backwater people that was pushing the Romans around. So the Romans act like they're in charge, but they get pushed around quite a bit. As the fact of the matter is, they didn't have a spine. They're pretty spineless. And they're pretty cowardly. And you think like these governors, they would be able to be like, no, my word is law. You don't get to tell me what to do. But no, that's not how these Romans act. They just kind of cave in, and it's one of those things that, like, once again, it's not like a serious issue, quote unquote, because it's like, oh, this Paul guy, he's spreading beliefs that are different from the status quo. And similar to Pontius Pilate ran into this problem too when the Jewish leaders brought Jesus to him. And they're like, oh, this guy, he's claiming to be the king of the Jews or whatever. And then Ponch is like, this is like a Jewish problem. Like, leave me alone. But then, of course, he ends up caving in because at the end of the day, the Romans don't have any real power. That grandeur of the Roman Empire is kind of not present. And of course, we look back and it's like, yeah, the Roman Empire ends up falling not too long later. I mean, it takes a couple hundred years from here anyway, but you can already see that, like, the beginning of that decline. That, like, the Romans are pretty spineless. The things you wouldn't think of the Romans. You would think these guys would be, being badass, hard asses. You can't tell me what to do. Conquered people. But that's not how it is. The Romans are very, like, wishy-washy and just go wherever the wind blows at them. And so it's kind of interesting that, like, the Bible really paints this kind of picture of the crumbling Roman world in contrast to the security of the resurrection. And that's what's interesting too, as we read in the last couple of chapters. All Paul ever brings up about, like, the people are accusing me of my beliefs of the resurrection. And so the contrast is the fleeting fleeting stability of first the Jewish religious order in the Sanhedrin, as we read in chapter 23, and even, like, these Roman governors, as we just read in chapter 24, as well as you reflect back on the book of Luke. The contrast is the assurance Paul has in the resurrection. So there's, like, a confidence that Paul has. And this is, once again, when we get to the book of Romans, we'll talk about this, because Paul mentions, like, my confidence in Christ. And, that's something Christians use all the freaking time. They always cite that passage and sometimes forget what it actually means at times, but it's to know that there's this contrast between that confidence and, of course, the fleeting kind of chaotic, the descent back into chaos, if you will, of the world, the worldly systems, religious orders of the Jews and the Romans, as two examples. But I think, of course, the main theological point that this last section of the book of Acts is getting at is how we can be, to know that we are secure in Christ, I should say, to know that we are secure in Him, despite how flimsy the world is. And that's all the more reason that we can trust Jesus, because Jesus has that assurance. He has that guarantee, if you will, that the world cannot give us. And so that's an interesting thing to think about as we read through the book of Acts. And the big contrast is the world is fleeting, but the kingdom of God is ever growing. And it's one of those things that, like, think of it like this. Now, of course, once again, religious thoughts and empires are not the same things. But think of how every empire that's existed has eventually fallen at some point. Yet Christianity is still strong relatively still strong, 2,000 years later. Of course, other religions have been around longer. But the idea is, empires come and go. But faith endures. And ultimately, God's faithfulness will endure forever. That's where we get that contrast. Because, of course, human faith can still wane. We're human, after all. It's just how it is. But once again, that's where Christ's promises play a big factor into how we maintain our faith and to be faithful, despite the empires that come and go. And Christianity has been around for the coming and goings of many an empire. So that's something to consider. Really not much else to say about chapter 24. Because once again, it's like Paul just retelling stuff from earlier to a different person. And so we had Felix, and we had... I like how, like, Felix is like... It kind of shows, like, he's so self-interested, where it's like, I keep Paul around, maybe I'll get a bribe, maybe make some money off this. Thinking, like, you know, the corrupt politician that he probably is. Or a corrupt police officer, basically some kind of corrupt official of some kind that, you know, we're easy to blast on social media these days. But no different back then, and it's no different now. So, just one of those funny things. And of course, you could make the joke about, man, Felix such a colonizer. Goes, works at some place, marries some local woman there. Like the colonizer that he is. Ooh! That's an oof. But just how it be, you know, that's how the world is. That's how the world is. It's not just Americans that do that. Contrary to what all those people will tell you. People have been doing it forever. But at the same time, to stop would be its own bad effect. Because then you have to convince everyone to go back in their own lane. Which, I hate to break it to you, ain't gonna happen. You can't expect people to revert their mindset to, what, 3,000 years ago of thinking? It's not gonna happen. And nobody wants to go reset the clock 3,000 years. Hell, people cried when people voted Republican several elections ago and said we went back 50 years. If people aren't willing to move their mindsets 50 back years, try to imagine forcing people to try and say, hey, you should think back how people used to think 3,000 years ago. And all of us go back to tribal living. It's not going to go far for you, buddy. It's not. But anyway, that's enough of the political ramblings. That should be safe for a podcast. I have not done one of those in a while. But anyway, yeah, that's it for chapter 24. Not much else to say. Because, once again, it's one of those things that, like, the Book of Acts will have this problem at the end of the book. Because it's just, how I think of it, I'll talk about this more when we read the next two chapters, because, once again, as we go through some repetitive parts in the next couple of chapters, basically, a more larger narrative way of looking at it, I guess you'd say, like a thematic way of looking at it, is the Bible is, it's one of those things like, I get, you know, we like to, you know, as we Christians claim, not like we like to say, but as Christians claim, the Bible is inspired by God. As, you know, reading Timothy. But there is some, you know, there's evidence of that as we read through, like, the Book of Acts. And the Book of Acts, as we read through the last chapters, which I'll talk about it more when we get there. But the Bible is very self-aware that, like, yeah, this is the last narrative, so we might as well just wrap up everything. And kind of like at like the end of any other narrative that you've ever read in your life. The Book of Acts acts that way. All puns intended. The Book of Acts behaves that way. And so the next few chapters, it'll be repetitive because the Bible is just kind of wrapping itself up. And then that's the end of the narratives. Because then, of course, you get into like the letters and stuff, but the letters don't like count. They're not narratives. And Revelation isn't a narrative in the traditional sense. So since the Book of Acts is the last narrative, the next couple of chapters, it acts that way and begins to wrap itself up. And so we kind of see that here in chapter 25. The Bible's starting to do that. It's just kind of closing up the Bible, and especially the Book of Acts. It's closing itself up. And they're like, well, the Book of Acts is all about this what is this movement? The spread of Christianity about? Well, it's about people who believe in the resurrection of Jesus. That's it. And so everything else that we read about was just like how we got there and ramifications of that as well. But at the end of the day, the movement itself was all about people who believe in the resurrection. That's it. No other, nothing else to say. And that was kind of how chapter 25 and 26 will do it too. Kind of treats it that like, yeah, that's the entirety of the gospel. And so that is something we follow, and we will follow it to the end. And that was the attitude that Paul has here in chapter 24. And it is an attitude that we as Christians must carry however far in the future we go. That is why, the Streaming Parson channel exists. To express that idea again in my own way. And every other Bible YouTuber, every other Bible show, every other Bible speaker, at least authentic Bible speakers anyway, will say it. That's just how it always is. And in a way, that's the apostolic tradition, is that we believe in the resurrection of Christ, and we will continue to carry it as time passes. Anyway, that's it. Unless you have any questions, I'm kind of done. I have not much to say today for Acts 20, 23 and 24. And of course the next few chapters will be like that too, because it's going to be a lot of recapping. So, but hey, today's just a quick Bible read. Yeah, you're gonna wonder how I'm gonna actually manage to make longer. Well, hopefully we won't have to make long streams. I don't want to have Bible streams that are like hours on end. Not because the Bible's not interesting, but because like I think I like to have shorter streams, which is ironic because once Xenoblade Chronicles comes up, we're gonna be doing 4-hour streams again. But now we're moving on to the housekeeping phase of the video. So if you have any questions, go ahead, shoot. And I don't mind answering longer questions today because we are basically done, and I've only been streaming for an hour and a half. But it's funny because so Xenoblade Chronicles is coming back, or I will be back streaming longer when Xenoblade Chronicles 3 comes out. And that's 8 hours a week already, more give or take. Because I'll stream from 2 to 6 Pacific time on Monday and Wednesday. So that's 2 days, 4 hours each. It's pretty long. But knowing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is gonna take me that long to get through the game. Like, I'm gonna joke about it now, but you just watch. I mean, you don't have to be a prophet of God to know this. Not that I'm claiming to be one, but I already know the first stream of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 will just be cutscenes, because that's how long. Like, you gotta do all that world building at the beginning of the game, right? It's gonna take you that long. Tutorial crap and all that stuff, right? The first week is just like 8 hours. You're barely gonna make a dent in the game. It's like I already know. So I also know that I'm gonna need long streams for those videos for that game. But when we get to the Book of Romans, which yes, by the time we do that, I will be moving the Bible streams back on Fridays. The Book of Romans, I'm gonna take a very different approach. So here I've been reading 2 chapters and then just talking story stuff and not doing as much theological diving as I could with as I've read through the other Bible books. But once again, when I was doing all of those, I was doing more of exploring the stories as opposed to so I mean I would naturally do this because it's the inner pastor in me, but I didn't do as much as a pastoral expedition as opposed to a narrative exploration, if that makes sense. No, I got those mixed up. I did more of a narrative expedition as opposed to pastoral explorations, in the sense of me talking about how, oh, we read Roman. So here's a little example. Like, as we read through the book of Romans and reading like the wages of sin is death, and then talk about how, like, from a pastoral perspective of how this plays out in our life, and all the more reason we need Christ's sacrifice for XYZ. I did that sometime just naturally when I was doing the expeditions of the stories. But when I was doing, like, for example, Genesis, I really only talked about the stories themselves. And of course, like, that was easy to do because when you're just reading the narrative outright, especially like when you read Genesis, something I know a lot more than any other book in the Bible, along with the book of Acts, you could, because the stories are so rich anyway, you don't have to do the pastoral explorations. But Romans isn't like that. Romans isn't a story. So when we do the book of Romans, we'll do a lot more pastoral exploration. And of course, I'm hoping you guys will be a lot more interactive and we can even dialogue with the book of Romans. And so with that being said, and also to keep the streams a bit shorter, I would only do one chapter every week with the book of Romans, maybe two. For example, like the first week of Romans, I'm going to do like chapters 1 and 2. But other weeks I would only do one chapter because, of course, the first chapter of the book of Romans is an introduction anyway. So with that said, though, we would do a lot more of a theological dive as opposed to like just exploring the stories. Because, of course, once again, the book of Romans is going to be very different. But you guys want the scheduling of how we're going to be doing things once the new season comes out, I guess you could say. Because I know it's weird. It's like we're in, the middle of July. We'll finish up the book of Acts probably the beginning of August because it's going to take me maybe at least 2 more weeks. So next week would be the last week in July. And then the week after that, it would already be August. That's so weird. And of course, the week after, we're going to start Xenoblade Chronicles 3. That's how I know. Because August 1st is the beginning of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 streams. I'll be joined here with my buddy Shining Light. And I'll stream 2 times. I'll stream Xenoblade Chronicles 3 2 times a week. On Monday and Wednesdays at 2 o'clock Pacific time. So write it down or, contact me on Discord and I'll type it down for you. And then the Bible reading streams will be moved back on Friday. So we'll actually finish the book of Acts on the 5th of August. And then we'll take like a couple weeks off and then start Romans. Probably closer to September, actually. Or maybe like just late August. I don't know if I want to wait a whole month to start the book of Romans. So I'll let you know more on that when we finish the book of Acts. But basically that's going to be the thing for a while. And then come like probably October, I'm gonna start a new Throwback Thursday. I should start one. So we'll see what I end up doing though, because I need to find something that works for streaming, or not streaming, sorry, for a Throwback Thursday series. So with that said, that's kind of the plan for the next little while. Mostly, keep your eyes peeled for Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and then of course we'll start the Book of Romans a couple weeks after we finish Acts. So that's kind of the foreseeable future. And then later down the road, I want to do Throwback Thursdays again. Because they're fun, and, I gotta be a boomer somewhere, so it's been a while since I've done it, so that'll be, look forward to that. But anyway, unless you have any questions or things like that, I think this is going to be the end of the stream. I'm gonna finish this coffee. Maybe go for a bit of a walk. It's nice out, so I mean it's already like 5, almost 5 o'clock. So actually, it's like the perfect time to go for a walk actually, because it's no longer that like beating heat of the afternoon. So maybe I'll go for like a little bit of a walk or something. I don't know. But anyway, this is gonna be the end of the stream. You guys enjoyed reading through Acts chapters 23 and 24. We'll be back next Wednesday for the next 2 chapters, 25 and 26. And that will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. And I will see you guys next Wednesday. God bless you.